Welcome, Jorge Duany. It is so great to have you back on the Cuban Studies website, Conversatorio Cubano. You were the very first scholar that we interviewed a whole year ago when we began the website. And now we have something really new to talk about, which is your fabulous edited volume with Carmen Aide Rivera, Cuba and Puerto Rico, Transdisciplinary Approaches to History, Literature, and Culture, which is a University of Florida press book, 2023, really a unique anthology in so many different ways. So I want to dive in and ask you first how this book emerged. How did you come to the idea of doing a book at all? And how did the final project take shape?
Well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about the book. And of course, I want to acknowledge from the beginning that you are one of the authors and represented. In fact, the first article is yours, and it's a very interesting comparison between Cuba and Puerto Rico from a historical perspective. So perhaps I shouldn't say this because the university presses don't like to promote books that have been based on conferences, but it was based on a conference held in 2019 here at Florida International University, the Cuban Research Institute conference, which had the general topic of Cuba and Puerto Rico, two wings of a bird, with a question mark. And that, of course, refers to the very famous poem by Lola Rodriguez de Tio, the 19th century Puerto Rican patriot poet, who emphasized the intertwined histories of Cuba and Puerto Rico in the 19th century and the early 20th century. So it began as a call for papers that my colleague Carmen Aide Rivera, who was part of that conference, made. Originally, I wasn't part of the project. I thought it was too much to handle, too many different topics, different authors, but she convinced me, and I eventually, joined the team. And then once the University Press of Florida was, involved with the project after doing the reviews, etc. We came up with a selection of papers which deal with the three main topics of the book: the history, the literature, and culture, understood in a broad sense. So that includes music and other cultural practices, literature as well. And so I think the end product, I'm very happy with it. It was a lot of work to synchronize these different styles, different disciplines, different topics, people all over the United States and Puerto Rico. But I think in the end, we did come up with a coherent set of papers that have in common precisely this general perspective that draws on Doña Lola's famous lines: Cuba and Puerto Rico are like two wings of one bird, and to explore exactly what that means in different areas of history and culture. In some cases where there's an explicit comparison, we come up with a list of similarities and a list of differences. In others, when there's more emphasis on a particular case study, then I think the question is, what does that case study say about the general connections between these two archipelagos? So in general, I think that's the origin and development of the book.
Well, I definitely, in terms of full disclosure, wanted to participate in what was the original panel that you had organized for this conference that became the book, because I have spent so much of my teaching life comparing Cuba and Puerto Rico. And I always confront something that I wrote about in the anthology, which is the myth of Cuba being a radical revolutionary country and Puerto Rico being this passive bystander to colonization by the United States, as well as by Spain before the United States. And of course, neither of those assessments are actually historically accurate. They are imposed more as an easy way to understand the similarities and differences. So how would you explain them? How do you explain the similarities and differences between Puerto Rico and Cuba in terms of geography, history, culture, and politics?
Yeah, I think geography is, of course, the point of departure for any systematic comparison between the two archipelagos. We often talk about islands, but both are, more complex than that. There's the main island of Cuba, the main island of Puerto Rico, but there are many other keys and smaller islands around it. So I may shift between archipelagos and islands in this conversation. But I think the geographic position of Cuba and Puerto Rico as part of the larger Antilles, and similarly located in terms of tropical climate. And nowadays, of course, we would also have to consider some of the larger effects of climate change, especially hurricanes, on the island's well-being, especially given the fact that Puerto Rico underwent a catastrophe with Hurricane Maria in 2017, but also earthquakes and all kinds of calamities that have affected the historical development of the two islands. Aside from the common location, which again was very important in the way that the two countries developed over time, Cuba being bigger, I think it's 12 times that Puerto Rico fits within the island of Cuba, and being more strategically located at the main entrance of the Caribbean to the Gulf of Mexico, and then becoming this commercial link between the New World and the Old World. And then Puerto Rico became kind of marginalized after the early 16th century because it was not located in one of the main shipping routes. That would change later on with the construction of the Panama Canal in the early 20th century. But I think those two areas of intersections, but also differences in the way that the two countries were included within the Spanish Empire had much to do with the way they developed. Cuba developed the largest plantation economy in the world in the 19th century. Puerto Rico was much smaller, although again in the 20th century, both islands became major exporters of sugarcane to the United States. And then politically speaking, one would begin by noting that the two countries were the last remaining colonies of Spain until 1898. So it's the longest period of Spanish influence anywhere in the Americas. But then, of course, after 1898, the two countries developed in different ways because Cuba became, at least officially, an independent republic, whereas Puerto Rico still remained under the colonial domination of the United States. And finally, I think the major difference between the two countries is the Cuban Revolution, 1959, where Cuba became progressively more distinct from the United States. And then, of course, during the Cold War, openly antagonistic to the United States, whereas Puerto Rico became increasingly integrated into the U.S. orbit, both economically and politically. And yet, despite the divergence, I think many of the chapters, including your own, highlight the surprising interconnections, the similarities and parallels between the two countries, even to this day.
Mm-hmm. If I had a dream book to read in the future, it would be one that would compare the development model of Cuba, which was a Soviet communist model of development from 1961 at least, if not 1960 forward until the early 90s, with the development model of Puerto Rico, which is like a colonial dependent development model that relies on foreign investment, especially that of the United States, and tax holidays and all that became this section of the U.S. federal tax code in which Puerto Rico fit. But one of the things that resulted from these two models is, ironically, that by the time you get to the late 80s, you have, I think it was 83% of the population of Puerto Rico depending on food stamps, even though they're employed. And Cuba, of course, having a food rationing system, and then you have very similar outcomes in terms of, health indicators. So these kinds of things they're fascinating to really look at because they seem so very different as countries, and yet they have these things in common. And so that leads me to this question, which is, why do you think there's so few books about Cuba and Puerto Rico published? Why is your anthology so very unique, given that both of us would concur that there is a need for the comparison?
I haven't really thought about that much. It's actually a big question, but let me try to propose a tentative answer. I think that the history of the disciplines in the United States, where most of us are based in this book, has led it to specialize in either Cuba or Puerto Rico, and perhaps another country like Mexico or the Dominican Republic, for example. But there's Cuban studies, which of course is more developed here in Florida. But Puerto Rican studies has developed traditionally in the Northeast, in New York, and now more recently, of course, is the Puerto Rican Studies Center down in Orlando. But really, the two fields have not intersected much in the past 50 years or so. I think those who study Cuba only, and those who study Puerto Rico only. So yeah, you're right. I think this is the first time that a significant group of scholars, both from the island of Puerto Rico and the United States, not so much, unfortunately, for political reasons as well, from Cuba. We don't have anyone living in Cuba represented in the collection. But I think in many ways, the isolation, the insularity of, and again, it's ironic because we're talking about archipelagos, and there's a whole field of archipelago studies that looks at places like the Caribbean or the Pacific as not only separate islands unto themselves, but places that are really bridges and places that connect each other. So that would be my initial reaction to that. You probably have your own ideas, and I'd be happy to listen to them.
Well, I think we have to add academic prejudice to the list of reasons. I mean, my own experience in the early 90s when I went to Puerto Rico to do a year's worth of research, which later became a master's thesis, which later became a book published by the University Press of Florida, Popular Expression and National Identity. It was published in 1998. That year that I spent in Puerto Rico was one that I took off between college and graduate school, and it was funded by this fellowship from my college, completely on the argument that really I hadn't been able to study Puerto Rican history at all, and I had gone to, a place that considered itself very prestigious. You could study Puerto Rican literature, you could study culture, but I couldn't really find a department anywhere except for the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I ultimately did my PhD, that offered classes on Puerto Rican history. So I had this argument, and when I went down there, one of the reactions that I had from a very prominent academic who will go unnamed is that, what are you doing? Puerto Rico isn't part of Latin America. It's part of the United States. That's useless. And I never forget it, because she lost all credibility in my mind when she made that argument to me, that statement to me, especially because it just seemed extraordinary that Puerto Rico would somehow be excommunicated from Latin America, despite its geography, despite its 300 years of Spanish colonialism or more, because it was the subject of imperial U.S. colonization. It just seemed extraordinary. So I do think that remains true, that many people who are Latin Americanists never study Puerto Rico. They never consider studying Puerto Rico, and they see its history as like an extension of U.S. history, as opposed to something that is valuable on its own. And yet, I mean, here's the next question, right? Puerto Ricans and Cubans have, both in terms of their island communities as well as their diaspora communities, often had a great deal of friction between them and among them over Puerto Rico and Cuba's very different political trajectories. So I wonder if you could comment on maybe your relationship to that analysis, perhaps, and more importantly, where you think we are right now. I mean, I do think that the mass exodus from Cuba and Puerto Rico, both islands, in the last several years, has led to a kind of change, shift perhaps, in the sensibility and the sensitivity among our communities toward each other. I don't know if that's due to political exhaustion or if it's in fact due to greater empathy. But I wonder what you think, if you could comment on that.
Let me focus on two topics in response to your question. First, let me say something about myself, because for me, this is really a very personal, as you know, enterprise. In a way, it's sort of circling back to the beginnings of my academic career many years ago, when I did my PhD dissertation on the Cuban community in Puerto Rico, of which I am a part. I grew up in Puerto Rico, born in Cuba, and left when I was a child and I arrived after 6 years in Panama in Puerto Rico. So I consider myself something of a Cuba Rican, and that's something that I write about in my chapter at the end of the collection. So yeah, I've tried for many years to understand how Cubans and Puerto Ricans who have so much in common together. They have language, they have the history, oftentimes religion, they like salsa, they like similar rice and beans dishes, and many other cultural practices. In fact, I don't think there are two people that are so similar to each other as Cubans and Puerto Ricans. And yet, as you say, there are some sources of friction, both in Puerto Rico, where there's a dwindling Cuban exile community now of roughly about 10,000 compared to when I arrived with my family, which were about 34,000 in the 60s. But yeah, those are they still remain. They're difficult, as I might say, intractable sources of friction. For example, the political one is probably the most obvious one, whereas most Cubans in Puerto Rico, and I would imagine in the U.S. as well, would support further integration of Puerto Rico into the U.S. probably through statehood, rather than maintaining the current status or, God forbid, becoming independent. And that's, of course, one of the main problems between Cubans in Puerto Rico and, many intellectuals, for example, and pro-independence supporters that view Cubans as not only as foreign elements on the island, but also as frankly, enemies, political enemies. There's an economic rivalry there as well, because in the 1960s, during the period when my family arrived, the sudden arrival of so many Cubans who were going to, excel in areas such as retail trade, the mass media. My own father was working in television for a long time. That created all kinds of conflicts between professionals and entrepreneurs in Puerto Rico who felt that the arrival of these refugees was a disloyal competition against them. And so those are a couple of the frictions. Now, if you think about what's going on in the U.S., and you look at the map of where Cubans and Puerto Ricans are located, at least until a few years ago, they were in separate places. I mean, Cubans came to Miami primarily, Puerto Ricans settled primarily in New York and New Jersey. They didn't really coincide very frequently, and they didn't really have to collaborate. So I think for much of the post-1960 period until about maybe 2000, they really, the two groups developed almost independently of each other. So Cubans in Miami, Puerto Ricans in New York. Now that changed somewhat, I think, with the emergence of the Puerto Rican population in Florida. But then again, looking at the map, most Puerto Ricans are not here in Miami. They're located in the Central Florida region and in Orlando, and then comparing the proportions of each, Cubans dominate Miami by a large margin, demographically, politically, economically, whereas Puerto Ricans are, the very large group there. So I think you'd have to look at specific moments and occasions in which the two groups have collaborated. And you can find that, for example, in a number of areas like literature or sometimes politics, because they might come together as Latino rather than Cuban or Puerto Rican politicians. And there's a lot of exchange, I think, in the arts, particularly in literature. And I think some of the strongest chapters in the book, and particularly with my colleague Carmena de Rivera, is precisely locating the connections between Puerto Rican-born or descended writers and Cuban-American writers who have different topics and different styles and so on, but they still can be taught, for example, and researched under the banner of Latino literature in the U.S.
I really want to thank you for taking the time and the trouble to create this volume with Carmena de Rivera, because I think it's going to be an invaluable resource. I myself am teaching my Cuban Puerto Rico class in the fall at the University of Florida, and we'll be using the book. So, I can't thank you enough for doing it and for sharing all of your thoughts today with our community on the Cuban Studies website.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for your contributions.